Hi everybody, welcome to the last day of the Jaipur Festival. We're going to be speaking to Nicholson Baker, who used to be a musician. He was trained in classical music and he played the bassoon for many years. What was it about that instrument that attracted you?
Such a good question, and let me say, I am so thrilled to be part of this incredible, amazing festival. I can't believe that it's the last day. I want it to go on forever. I want to move here. What tempted me about the bassoon, I was a fourth grader, which means I was 10 years old. And some people wanted to play the drums, and some people wanted to play the flute or the clarinet. I looked at this machine. It was made of beautiful stained wood, and it had these very long nickel-plated keys. So my thumb, as it turned out, one human thumb controlled something like 12 or 13 keys. Can you imagine the left thumb having that much power? So it was just an obvious thing to do. So I started to practice, and I got fairly good at it, and I decided I wanted to be a composer of music, and then realized that you needed more than a thumb to be a composer. You needed to actually have a good ear, and I was a little less good at that, so I ended up being a writer.
And you switched to literature from music. What kind of music do you listen to now? Do you own an iPod?
I listen to when I'm writing, I listen to different things than when I am not writing, as you know. Do you listen to music while you write?
Not music with a beat.
Oh. See, I have to have a beat. I have to have an extremely strong, almost distractingly powerful thumping beat when I'm writing, because it distracts me from the fact that yesterday's writing wasn't that good. So I learned this writing a book about 1994. I was writing a book that the writing was okay for a while, and then at the end of the day, when you stop, obviously the writing is less good, you know, because that's why you stop. And so the next day, you always have to start reading the worst writing that you did the day before. What I realized is if you have really loud music pumping into your ears, it distracts you from your own infelicities. So.
And you went to the Medieval Pundits concert last night and liked it.
I mean, the Medieval Pundits are very good, and they've got a very good beat. I'm going to buy their stuff when I get home. I can't buy on iTunes when I'm here in India because it says, no, you're not allowed, because they have, I guess, regional variations. But as soon as I get home, I'm going to be listening. That's the kind of thing I like to write to, because it doesn't have so many words. If people are saying things while I'm trying to be saying things, it gets a little distracting, obviously. I also started to, realized that if we live in a world where you can buy a piece of software like Apple's Logic, and you can be a pianist or a Balinese gamelan player or something. So, so lately I've gotten back into writing music, and it's really been absolutely tremendously therapeutic, especially on airplanes.
And you also write music.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was flying here to India, I brought my keyboard with me, and you can sort of arrange it. The tray table is a little small, but you can arrange the computer and then the keyboard, the piano keyboard in front of it. And the flight attendants are very forgiving. And the only problem is you can't actually eat dinner and compose your music and play the keyboard at the same time. But it's a very good way to pass 3 or 4 hours on an airplane.
Also helps to fly business, I think.
Well, yes. I mean, And how often do we get to do that? Only when we go to the Jaipur festival. It's not like in the United States, we're just writers. Here we're authors, which means we fly business, so we have a good time.
Tell us a little something about how your writing life began. I know you have written on a typewriter back in the early days. Tell us something also about how you became, how you came to writing.
I first wanted to be a writer when a friend of my father's delivered a whole lot of science fiction paperbacks, and they were sitting, I remember them sitting on the ironing board, this just stack of old, well-thumbed science fiction books, and I read them all, and I thought, I want to write about being in a rocket ship and going to a different nebula or something like that. So I wrote this was in 4th grade, I wrote little short stories about how the Earth ran out of air. That was one of my stories was called Gasp, and the words trailed off. You know, the last word was gasp because the oxygen had run out. And then I stopped. I guess I stopped, and then I started writing again when I discovered Vladimir Nabokov when I was about 15, and he just not Lolita, because I wasn't really interested in reading words about, I mean, Lolita is a truly shocking and almost unreadably shocking book, actually, at this point, I think. But I read this story that's also part of his nonfiction book, Pale Fire, called First Love, and it's just about him going to the seaside and meeting this girl, and he's about 11. And there's a description of riding on a train that just completely floored me. And I wanted to be a writer after that. Unfortunately, I was a bassoonist at the time. And then I thought, okay, my plan is, I have a clever plan, which is I will support myself as a bassoonist, and I will be a writer. And I got a tuxedo, and I was a professional bassoonist for about 3 months. And it was fun, and then I realized that wasn't going to work, so I got a job on Wall Street instead.
You had all kinds of jobs, including technical writing and a job on Wall Street. Was that purely to pay the bills?
No, I think it was the Wall Street job. Well, for one thing, it turned out that it was incredibly important to me, because the Wall Street job was at a firm. It wasn't actually on Wall Street, it was on Water Street, downtown Manhattan, but there was an escalator in the lobby, a beautiful, huge escalator, and every morning I got to work and I pushed through the revolving doors and I stepped onto this escalator to the mezzanine. And so when I started, then some years later, when I wanted to write my first novel, I was 30 and I'd given myself a deadline, write a book by the time you're 30, I thought, why not make the whole novel be just the escalator ride to the and the mezzanine is a good word because you're not actually there. You're halfway there, you know? You haven't succeeded in getting to where you want to go. And I knew that my first novel was not going to succeed in getting me to the first floor. It was only going to get me to the mezzanine. So I ended up writing this book about a guy who gets on the escalator. He's just gone on an errand. His shoelaces have done something very strange. Maybe you've experienced this, where one day, let's say it's a Tuesday, you tie your shoes and boop, one lace breaks. And then 2 days later, 1 day later, you tie your right shoe and it breaks as well. And you think, wait a second. So the same forces, and so I have my narrator think about that. Why is it that two independent shoelaces would break very close together? Is it the stresses of walking, because obviously we have the same number of steps roughly, or is it the stresses of pulling the shoes? You know, I wanted to be true to the way people actually think about life. And when you're on Wall Street, supposedly you want to make money. I didn't understand that. I, of course, would like to have money, but I wasn't very good at making money. And I had no inside information. But I did have a broken shoelace, you know, so I wrote about what I knew.
In fact, there's a long section in his first novel about shoelaces. The Mezzanine appeared in 1988. It's the first book I read by Nicholson Baker. It's a novel about a man at the end of his lunch break who's taking an escalator back to his office. And during that short ride, his entire life is reconstructed with footnotes, often very long footnotes, in a very precise, almost relentless way. You've said that it is a sentimental book. I wonder if the kind of detail with which you describe objects and memories in The Mezzanine is a kind of nostalgia.
Yes, I think that's true. I grew up feeling a kind of weird love for packaging, for, let's say, the jars. In the United States, there's a certain kind of mayonnaise, Hellmann's mayonnaise, and Jif or Skippy peanut butter, and each kind of product has a different shape of jar. I'm sure that's true here, so that you can go to the store and immediately know where you are. You're in the mayonnaise aisle or something. And as a kid, I thought, this is so good that fate has given us these different jar shapes, and what I hoped was that they would never ever change. I mean, they're glass. They were glass at that time. And so it really it bothered me around 1989, 1990, when they started to become plastic, because they were the same shape, but they weren't the same thing, you know. So The Mezzanine is my attempt to be sentimental about things that you don't normally, you're not supposed to feel sentimental about. I don't understand why people don't feel sentimental about all sorts of things. The shape of plugs, the particular way, let's say, a big busy intersection is handled, the way old traffic lights work versus new traffic lights. Things are change so often, and sometimes when they change, you just feel that moment of real grief that the old thing is gone, and that nobody has mourned it. Nobody has said, wait, we lived with this older way for 25 years, and nobody even bothered to write about it when it was in its heyday, much less when it was in its moment of disappearance.
Well, Nicholson's done more than just write about it. He's also actually preserved old things, but we'll come back to that in a minute. We're going to talk about The Mezzanine a little more. As I said, it's a novel with very long footnotes, and this is long before David Foster Wallace. And you have to wonder, as a publisher, getting a novel about a man on an escalator on his lunch break, 150-page novel, with sometimes the footnotes, the novel itself would be 3 lines on a page, and the rest of the page would be taken up with a footnote that would then spill over onto the next page. You have to wonder, how did the publisher react to a novel like this?
Not very well. I learned to like the footnote when I was a little kid, because I read a book called How to Attract the Wombat. I don't remember who wrote it, but it had lots of beautiful footnotes, and it was the old style of footnoting with the daggers and the asterisks, you know, those into weird shapes, typographical symbols that we don't normally see. And I thought, I love these things that are sort of sitting at the bottom of the page, these secret things that are waiting for us. So you read a log, and then you have a trap door, and I'm falling to the footnote. Oh, interesting, I like the footnote. Then you go back up. So I love all that. And then I read Samuel Johnson's biography by Boswell. Huge footnotes in that. And then the second thing that was big for me is I was supporting myself at that time as a professional typist. That was back when there were these enormous machines called word processing machines. They were the size of small, desks. And I was pretty good at typing what other people wrote. So I worked for lawyers, and I typed what they wrote. And lawyers love to use footnotes. So I had to type enormous footnotes. I actually wrote a piece of software that split footnotes up into several pages, so that conveniently, so that if you wrote a legal brief, if you were going to court and you wanted to have a long footnote, you could spread it out. So I had footnotes on my brain when I was about 28, 29, and I suddenly thought, this is my salvation, because I always have too much to say about things. I have more to say than there's room to say, and more to say than I think most readers have patience to read. So the lovely thing about a footnote is it's a switch, and you can choose. You can say, well, I'm going to continue to read about whatever's happening in the paragraph in process, or I can escape into this alternative world. I can stop time, in a sense, and go down and read this secret, smushed down, tiny kind of ghetto of words, and then go back up and read the thing. I can do either one. I thought, well, I'll allow the reader to have a choice. I'll write the longest footnotes in the history of the novel, and I feel that I did that. That's my small achievement. And then I will have been able to say what I actually wanted to say. And then once I finished the mezzanine with all those footnotes, I thought, I'm never going to write a footnote again, ever.
And the last footnote of those footnotes was a footnote about a footnote, about footnotes.
Well, there's an interesting history in footnotes. I mean, there's a lot to be said about those things. I talked to a man who was a scholar, a literary scholar at Berkeley. He said, "Oh, you mean the mise en page?" You know, and it's true. It's a very French idea that to study not marginalia, but what happens at the bottom. I felt that was sort of in the forefront of all that. Then came David Foster Wallace and blew me out of the water.
Was the novel snapped up by a publisher?
Well, I had an agent because I'd had a few stories in a magazine, a couple of magazines, so she sent it around to 11 publishers, and they all sent it back saying it isn't a novel or it doesn't work as a novel. And one person said, it would be interesting if you removed the footnotes and melted them back into the text. And I said no, and I didn't want to do that. And then I found a nice smaller publisher, a British publisher, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. I mean, they're not small in England, but they had just begun an outpost in the United States. And I said, why don't you send it to Weidenfeld and Nicholson? It's not spelled like, my name is Nicholson with an H, but they didn't have the H. Anyway, they published it, and they were very nice about it. And then it just sort of happened. But it was very helpful to me to realize that rejection is a good thing, I guess. It's a helpful thing. It's good for the character. I started getting rejected in college, actually. I started sending out my stories to places and watching them. And then I would sort of wait for them to come back, and it was an interesting rhythm. I think I almost would have been disappointed if they didn't come back, because, you know, it's sort of like I'm giving you my story, and you'll give me back my own self-addressed envelope. That's the transaction. That's what it means. That's what it's all about. And there were such beautiful printed rejection letters. So I had about, 50 or 75 rejection letters about stories by the time I got a couple of acceptances. And so I was, familiar with the idea of rejection.
As Vidya Naipaul was saying yesterday, rejection for a young writer can help you go forward in a way. Can I ask you about money? Did you make any with the first novel, and was there a time when you thought you might have to go back to technical writing, or did you think, this is it, I've moved on, no more, this is my job, henceforth?
I'll tell you just honestly, maybe it's interesting. I got $11,000 for the mezzanine from Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and then another 11,000, I can't even remember now, some money from the British, and then the Germans and the French. The strange thing about being a literary writer, you know this, you get some money from the country of origin, in my case the United States, and then it's like popcorn in the movie business. How do the movie theaters stay alive? They sell popcorn. So you sell the translation rights all over the world, and then little bits of money come in. You think, oh my God, it's Serbo-Croatian $700 today, you know, it's great. So I sort of limped along. I had one child, I had a wife, I had a small family, and I was 30, and suddenly I was supporting a family, and it worked. It worked for a while. Now publishing is in a state of collapse, and my career is in its twilight, but at that point, I was having a great time, actually. It was the beginning of being able to support myself as a writer. And there's something useful about knowing that the only way the money is going to come in is if you actually sit down and write something publishable. That's an interesting, frightening feeling.
And does being a father kind of sharpen that feeling?
Absolutely. I think the best thing that I ever did was to get married and then have a child. There's a hormonal surge that probably everybody knows who's had a small baby. Suddenly you feel you have to get to work and convince the world that you're a responsible person. I was working, supporting myself, you know, as a typist, not just as a typist, but as a temporary typist, which means you are the lowest person on the whole corporate totem pole. You're the person who shows up with a kind of, you know, you're wearing a suit jacket as a blazer, you're pretending to be well dressed, and you show up to type. You are at the bottom. And the wonderful thing about that is you have no responsibilities, you just have to type quickly. But is being at the bottom like that, is that a good thing if you are a father? Well, not so much. I wanted to come up with a job for myself that I could proudly tell my daughter was what I did when she got to the point where she could understand that people had jobs. And so saying to my daughter, I'm a temp, would probably not be the right thing. So I got a regular job as a technical writer and then a regular job as a writer, and that worked better.
Let's talk about poetry a little bit. It's a running theme in this festival, you know, which in itself is an astonishment. Poetry, theme of a huge literary festival. You are a professor of poetry at the European Graduate School in Switzerland. Who are the poets you read and reread, and do you memorize poems? And if you do, is there one you could give us?
First, let me say about the European Graduate School, it's a wonderful place in Switzerland, and I've been there, I've taught there. I just want to be clear, because on the Wikipedia page about me, which I never edit except once or twice, they keep putting this thing about how I am a professor at the European Graduate School. I have taught there for 2 days, you know. I mean, and I loved it. And these people were smart, and I did my best to say things that would interest them. But the notion that I'm a professor of anything is ridiculous.
Well,
okay.
Their homepage still lists you as one of their professors.
And I was a professor, and they paid me to come to Switzerland and spend a day with these nice, bright students who were from all over the world, who were able to get a graduate degree at this place. I then was so fascinated by the experience of going to Switzerland and thinking about it that I used it as a scene in a book that I wrote called The Anthologist about a poet, and I changed it. I made it a poetry conference because I took this walk up the mountains and I could see this blinding reflection from another mountain up in the Swiss mountains. It was in the summer, but there was still snow on the mountains then. They hadn't all melted. And I just loved the whole thing, and so I fictionalized it slightly in this book about a poet who is trying. His name is Paul Chowder, and the book is called The Anthologies because he is trying to come up with an anthology of rhyming poetry. That's what his job is, not just to come up with an anthology, which is very difficult. Don't you love anthologies? I mean, all anthologies are different. The universe of anthologies is a separate universe than the universe of poetry. But he has to write an introduction to all of rhyming poetry, and it's very difficult for him.
He keeps putting it off.
He keeps putting it off. And what I was having to do was, in fact, the factual thing that it was based on was I was supposed to write an introduction to a book that my wife and I were doing about old newspapers. And I had taken the pictures of these big, beautiful newspaper volumes that I'd saved from the British Library. And my wife was writing the book. And I was supposed to write the introduction. And I would go up into, we have a barn. We live in Maine in the United States, and we have a very large barn that's completely empty on the second floor. And I went up to the barn to write the introduction day after day, and I didn't write it. And I felt awful because I would come down from the barn. Instead of writing the introduction to poetry, to newspapers, I was setting old poetry to music. Poe and all sorts of people, Dryden. And I was figuring out something that I then thought, was kind of, I thought, in a strange way, revolutionary, which was that I thought I had come up with a new theory of meter, and it was about iambic pentameter. Do you know that word, iambic pentameter? Iambic pentameter, pent means 5, iamb is an upbeat. So if you have, let's say, a couplet by Dryden that goes, all human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. That's 5. My hands went 5 times, but listen to it again. All human things are subject to decay, rest, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey, rest. Obviously, 5 is not a stable number. The number is 6. When I realized that, I was sitting in a white plastic chair on the lawn saying, true wit is nature to advantage dressed, rest, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed, rest. Women come and go, talking of Michelangelo, rest. So I was just sitting there saying lots of iambic pentameter to myself, realizing that it had a secret life, it had a rest, it had something going on at the end. Then I realized I had a novel, and that's when I wrote The Anthologist.
The Anthologist is Paul Chowder in this book and in Nicholson's most recent book. Who says at one point that poetry is prose in slow motion. What are the questions that fiction asks of life, and what are the questions that poetry asks?
God, that's a difficult question. How would you answer that? I don't know. I don't know what to say. You know more about that than I do because you've read. I've only had one poem in my life published, Jeet. You've had many poems, so you have to. I have only prose really to go by. Well, how would you answer that, please?
I think you have answered it. Poetry is prose in slow motion. I think that's, it's. I think what poetry really does is it stretches time. It plays with time, and I would say it asks the more difficult questions, the questions that may not be, that may not have an easy answer.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And what I found when I was starting to have a yearning to be a prose writer was the thing that taught me the most about life, about grief, about happiness, all the good things that we want to think about. I was reading poetry. So I was living in New York, working on in this Wall Street firm, and I would go to the bookstore, which closed at midnight, and buy a book of poetry. And so I learned to write prose, to write the kind of dense prose that I really wanted to read by reading the poets of the 50s and 60s like Stanley Kunitz and Howard Moss and people like that. And that I still feel was the most important thing. It wasn't going to college and being a literature major was helpful. I was forced to read lots of stuff, but it wasn't until afterwards, reading poets, I just had not even heard their names in college, but they were the ones to read, I found.
It's very interesting to me that you say that, because I can completely understand how you would write the kind of fiction that you write after having read poetry, because strict form is a kind of a paradox, and it's a kind of a cage that makes for exhilaration and freedom. If you have a very formal poem, within the form, within that cage, you can range very freely. And I think that many of your novels take as a starting point the imposition of a limitation, and often a limitation that stretches for the length of a book. Is that an attractive project for you, limitation?
Yes, I think it's a very useful thing to say. Well, maybe novelists are like graduate students. You know how graduate student advisors always say, narrow down your topic, bring it close, bring it. So I felt that I was like a good graduate student, at least in the Mezzanine, and the second book, which is about fatherhood. If you write about fatherhood, it's a huge subject, and it has no boundaries. It's sort of a cloud. But if you write about a man sitting in a rocking chair, giving a bottle to a baby on a certain day, you have something. And so yes, there's a benefit to be gained by narrowing things down in a way that isn't actually narrowing. You're actually not narrowing them, you are opening them up. You are saying, this moment there's more to this moment. It's longer than you thought, So in Room Temperature, the second book, he's sitting in a rocking chair. This is all based on my own experience. I had a little baby and I gave her a bottle. I sat in a rocking chair. My wife was at work. She was supporting us. And I blew a puff of air towards a mobile that was made of straws and Chinese cookie fortunes. The fortunes that they were hanging. My wife had made this fortune cookie mobile that was hanging over the crib. And I blew this puff of air, and I waited for the puff of air to reach the mobile. It took a long time. So in the book, he blows the puff of air in chapter 1, and the puff of air doesn't reach the mobile over the crib until chapter 7. Slow it down. Take some time. Enjoy it.
It's been said that your narrators are often obsessively observant about the kind of things that most people wouldn't even notice. For example, shoelaces, pencil sharpeners, a puff of air. Is close observation a kind of love, and is the project of observation linked to the project of preservation?
Close observation is a kind of love. That's beautifully said. I think the problem is, if you are a clinical person, if you are doing an autopsy on things, you're making a mistake. If you're saying life is empty, it's like it's cold, it's dead, and I'm just going to describe it, you're not going to get anywhere. If you start by thinking of a sentence that begins, I love when X, you're going to get somewhere, because you're going to actually learn what really pulls you. So talking about things, but talking also about social moments, the little moments where people are polite to each other in ways that we haven't fully codified, that all those sorts of things, just somebody. I really like trying to find out the secret, smaller ways in which we're, say, polite to each other, or, and maybe it sounds like I'm too nice, but one thing I've found, and I tried to put this in the Anthologist, is that the best thing that I could do as a writer, the thing that helped me the most, maybe you have a trick like this, but I'll pass it on, my little trick to life. I have two tricks, actually, but I'll tell you the first one is, I ask myself at some time in the day, what is the best thing that happened to you today? It seems very simple. But if you ask that question, you come up with an answer that's different than if you ask, what happened to me today? If you ask, what happened to me today, it's usually some tiresome thing that you were delayed, and the lock didn't work and there was the tires. But if you ask what was the best thing that happened to me today, you'll think of some, shadow play from the palmetto fronds. You'll think of a moment where somebody just did something nice. It's useful because you end up filtering it that way. You end up with a reason for living if you do that every day. So that approach is what's helped me a lot, is honing in and asking the right question, I guess, or what I thought was the right question.
Let's talk a little about preservation. You've bought early American newspapers, and by that I don't mean newspaper offices or the institution, but actual copies of early newspapers to save them from destruction. What's the source of that instinct to preserve?
It began just purely by chance. I found out that libraries in the United States were throwing out things that I didn't think should be thrown out. I ended up suing the San Francisco Public Library for throwing out 250,000 books. And then at some point, somebody, a cartoon collector named Bill Blackbeard, isn't that a great name? A man with a razor blade who would go through old newspaper volumes. A volume of a newspaper is a gigantic thing. It's bigger than any medieval codex. It's huge. It's more like some sort of bound volume of maps. And American libraries, in their infinite wisdom, decided that these things were doomed. They were going to become embrittled. They were going to collapse. And so we had to microfilm it, is take little pictures on plastic of these old newspapers. And so they began, even the great libraries in the United States, which is the New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, they just decimated their collection of American newspapers. Now think of any city that you can possibly think of and how you would do the history of that city from, say, 1909, 1898. How would you know anything about that city? Well, you have all the individual lives and diaries. And then you have the things that people read every day. 1 million copies every day in New York City, poured out of the basement of a building, the New York World Building. 1 million copies a day. Now think of this. How many of those copies have survived? 1 or 2. Okay, we're talking about some of the rarest published, widely read material in the history of humanity, right? Except for the things that are gone altogether. And it turned out that the British Library, because it's an imperialist monster, had a huge collection of international newspapers, papers from India, papers from all over the world, South America, and the United States. And I tried to convince them not to auction these papers off because I described that they would be destroyed if they were auctioned off. People cut out the comics and they throw everything else away. And they said, no, we need the money. We're moving to a big new building that's actually not that big. And so I ended up having to raise the money and buy the papers on auction, and my wife and I became amateur librarians, and I found out that the newspapers were really worth saving. It's probably the biggest adventure of my life, and this ended in 2004 when finally all 20 or 30 tons of American newspapers that I'd ended up buying went in 5 tractor-trailer trucks to North Carolina to be part of the Duke University Rare Books collection. I don't have to worry about them anymore, and they're safe. So I'm happy. Thank you.
Would you like to read us something from read aloud from a piece you've written about reading aloud?
Yes. I'll tell you that, so going way back in time to 1992, I'd written a book that was a phone sex book. It was about 2 people, naked people, talking on the phone. That's how my daughter described it, which is embarrassing. I shouldn't say that. She said, Daddy's written a book about 2 naked people talking on the phone. No. So the publisher said, all right, we're going to make a whore out of you. We're going to send you on tour. This is going to be big because they'd gotten some preliminary reaction from the sales force. And Vox is going to be big, so we're going to send you on the Vox tour. And you're going to go around to, San Francisco and Chicago and Madison, Wisconsin, and you're going to read from this book. And I said, no, I'm not. I am not going to read from this book, because what is a novel? It's a beautiful machine that allows you to do things in private. You read it, and nobody else knows you're reading it, and nobody else cares you're reading it, and you're in your own little world. And so I said, I'm not going to read from the book, but I will go on the tour, and I will write something about the experience of having to give a reading. It has not, so I went from city to city, promoting this really quite, in some ways, for its time. For 1992, it was a dirty book, without really talking about sex at all, and I'm very proud of that. I've almost never read aloud from any of. I've written 3 sex books. I gave one reading from the second sex book, and it was a horrific experience, really. It was no fun, because no audience wants to sit and watch this bald guy, read his stupid book about sex. No, it might be that there's some things that you would want to read, but you don't want to read it, you don't want to listen to him say it. A few years ago, I did my first reading, is how I started my reading about reading aloud. It was at the Edinburgh Festival in Scotland under a tent. Several others read, too, and we all sat on independent sections of a biomorphic orange modular couch, our heads bowed as we listened or half-listened to each other. Eventually my turn came, and the words that I'd written in silence, in earplug-enhanced silence, as a matter of fact, it amplified the fleeting chiclety contact of upper and lower incisors and made audible the inner squirt of an eyeball when I rubbed it roughly. You know how that happens? When you rub your eyeball and you can actually hear it? You can actually hear your eyeball? I wanted to put that on a paragraph, and called to my attention the muffled roar of eyelid muscles when my eyes were squeezed shut in an effort to see, using the infrared of prose, whatever it was that I most wanted at that moment to describe. These formerly silent words unfolded themselves like lawn chairs in my mouth and emerged one by one, wearing large Siberian hats of consonants and long, erminous vowels, and they landed softly without visible damage here and there in the audience, and I thought, gosh, I'm reading aloud from chapter 7. Things went pretty well until I got to a place near the middle of the last paragraph where I began to feel that I was going to cry. I wouldn't have minded crying, or at least pausing to swallow down a discreet silent sob if what I'd been reading had been in any obvious way sad. You know how that is when people tell their stories on television and you get to that moment where they reach the moment of grief and they cry. Of course you want them to cry. But what was I talking about? I was talking about the things I had written about in the mezzanine. The sentence that was giving me difficulty was a description of a woman enclosing a breakfast muffin in bakery tissue, placing it in a small bag and sprinkling it with coffee stirrers and sugar packets and pre-portioned pats of butter. Where was the pathos? And yet by the time I delivered the words, plastic stirrers, to the audience, I was in serious trouble. I noticed a listening head or two look up with sudden curiosity. This is interesting. This American is going to weep openly and copiously for us now. That's the beginning of the essay that I wrote. There are 2 forms of the essay, so we're taught in college. The deductive and the inductive. You know that? The deductive, I never got it. I never understood it. You're supposed to start by saying what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you end by saying what you did say. That's ridiculous. That's a wrong way to proceed, because most of the time we're feeling our way blindly through life. I like the inductive essay, which is where you start by saying what you think might be possible, and it turns out to be wrong, and then you go over here, and then you go on the other hand, and yet, and then you end with a little whimper, and that's a truer to life, you know. So that's the kind of essay I like to write.
And then there's the reductive essay, which you find on the edit pages of Indian newspapers.
That's when you condense everything down to the size of a bouillon cube.
Right. Let's talk about House of Holes for a minute, and then we're going to open it up questions from the audience. How did House of Holes come about, considering you'd already written 2 sex books, Vox and The Fermata? Why did you come back?
Well, so the Fermata, Vox was the one about the naked people on the phone. The Fermata is about being able to stop time and do all kinds of insane, dirty things. And that came out in '94. So I was 35 or 36 at that point. When I finished writing the Fermata, I was completely done with sex, and I felt I'd been part of this little tiny revolution that was sort of based in San Francisco. And I wrote about other things. I wrote about library history and World War II and poetry and lighting a fire in the morning and writing about whatever you think about. And then I got to be about, I think I was 56, and realized the time was running out. And that if you write 2 books on a subject, it doesn't, you know, nobody talks about so-and-so's diptych, you know, or something. So I thought, this is my last chance to write a really unbelievably over-the-toply, maybe worth writing, dirty book. So I wrote House of Holes, which is about a pleasure place that you can go there by looking in the hole of a pen, or by finding a little round. Some of the people go there by climbing in a dryer and going to the dark side of the dryer. You know, if you climb into the dryer, I always thought there might be an alternative universe beyond the dryer. So the House of Holes is a pleasure place that you go, and nobody gets hurt, and there are no dungeons, and there are no whips, and there are no chains. There's just nice people having orgasms. And there's something called the porndecahedron. Yeah.
And the masturbotes.
Right.
It's a very strange, sexy and funny book, and I think the great thing about the book is you will enjoy it, male or female, and there's parts in it that will make you laugh out loud. And I wondered if that was an objective for you when you were writing the book, to be entertaining.
My wife read it, and she said, well, you know, chapter 6 is a little bit sexy, but I sat on the stairs while she read it in the book in the kitchen, and I would wait for her to, if she possibly would laugh. It turns out that what I really want to do, I mean, in writing about sex, is not, it's a great privilege to think that you can possibly bring a reader to a state of mild arousal. I mean, honestly, that is an ambition that I've had as a younger man when my beard was black. Now I would just like to make people laugh. I think sex is really funny. It's really interesting. I still like thinking about it, and it turns out that that the kind of sex book that you write in your 50s is more of a comic novel than it is, you know, a deeply erotic novel. Although I have to say, truthfully, that every single scene in that book, I found arousing. As I was writing it, I did. I can't help it. I did. I liked writing it. It is very much fun to write dirty scenes, and it slows you down.
What would be the point otherwise?
Right. Well, I mean, some people say, I'm a dark literary writer, and I'm going to write about sex. I'm going to write about the fact that it's not sexy, and I'm going to make you unhappy. And therefore, I'm a literary writer, and I don't believe in that. I think your job is to, if you're Stephen King and you are horror writer, your job is to create fear. Well, I can't do that. I mean, I'm not interested in creating fear. Creating arousal is a worthy ambition. And in fact, in the Fermata, there are many fantasies about the narrator wants to bury a dirty story in the sand. He stops time, buries the dirty story in the sand, so that the woman, as she's idly digging in the sand, will, oh, what's this in a plastic bag? It's a dirty story. Let me open it up and start reading. And then he watches, you know, so that has always been an interest of mine, is this kind of fantasy of planting things in the lives of readers that they will have to encounter. And then they will be, you know, secretly excited by it. I'm saying much more than I should be here.
If you're tweeting, that was a good one. Creating arousal is a worthwhile goal. Was that it?
I don't remember.
Okay. Questions? Yes.
Hello. Hello, sir.
Hello.
My question is to you, so what exactly happens with a writer when he is writing? And is the idea or theme predetermined before you start writing a piece of fiction?
What happens with a writer when he's writing, and I didn't hear the rest?
And is the idea or theme is predetermined before you start writing a piece of fiction?
Sorry, could you
Is the idea or
could you
theme?
say that slowly?
The problem is it's hard to hear because it doesn't. Oh, the themes. Themes are really tricky. I don't understand what a theme means. It seems like something that you were told to find the theme of a book. Let's say a classic of literature. You're told to find the theme of a book in school. I never understood it. I don't know what a theme is. I don't even understand the word. I don't even like the word. So I think that, but on the other hand, you know, you have to say, you know, in a setting like this, I have to say to you what a book is about, and I guess that's the theme. It's not, what I like to do is start up and get sort of engaged in a cog railway of ideas and metaphors and things that pull me forward as a kind of replacement for a plot. Now, if you're writing nonfiction, it's a whole different thing. In nonfiction, I want to convince you that what I have to say has some merit. It's a whole different world. If you want, let's say I recently wrote a book about, or wrote a magazine article about going to Korea and figuring out how liquid crystal screens were made. And it was really a lot of fun because I got to go to the factory in Korea and see the LG screens being made by a huge robot, this arm that would flip these huge 6 feet high pieces of glass around. And my job was to describe that. So the theme of that, obviously, is the mass production of the things that we stare at all day long. And I need to convince you. But when you're writing a work of fiction, you want to be hooked yourself, be pulled forward, and maybe have people pulled forward with you, and figure out what's going on as it's going on.
Yes. The guy in the middle there.
Yeah, hello, sir. I was just reading a New York Times article on you, and they called you the mad scientist of smart, which means I have to get a hold on all your books now.
Only 3 of them are smutty, but so you got to be sure to get the right ones.
Okay, I'll make sure I get the right
15, but only 3, so that's 1/5. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is that how do you maximize the effect of curse words in a novel without using too many words? And I'm asking this in the context of, let's say, a writer who's writing, whose characters, let's say in India, whose characters are based in, let's say, a more rustic setting where the vernacular language is different. And even though the language I'm using is theirs, but I'm writing primarily for an English for an audience which will be reading it in English and who might not be familiar with that vernacular language. So it gets lost in translation, the effect of any, not specifically curse words only, but other things also. And maybe I would also want Jeet Thayil to help answer that, because your characters are based sometimes in such a situation. So what would you suggest for an author? What exactly do you write to maximize the effect, or do you do you consider the audience which you are writing for? How do you maximize the effect of your words?
Yes, Jeet, how do you do it? Because I need to know.
Well, I'm still figuring that one out. So, and I think if you ever do figure that out, and especially if you think about maximization and monetization and a lot of those other very fashionable, trendy words, and think about the audience you're writing for, and think about how much the book will be priced at and how many copies you sell, I think you're going to write a terrible book.
Okay, that's true. But it is really a complicated and interesting problem, though. The problem of what kind of word you're going to use, especially if you're writing about sex, or anything, but especially sex, because this is important to us, and there are lots of single-syllable words that do the job, but they're very familiar. So what I tried to do in all three books, actually, was invent words, come up with new words that would sound like they were not new, like vag. Okay, I know. But in the second book, I came up with that, and I noticed some people used it, and I was really happy about that. But so in the third book, I really went wild. I sort of went farther in that direction.
Talking about House of Holes, which has lists of words for well-known parts of the anatomy.
Yes, I didn't make the list, though. This copy editor, who was a very thorough man, went through my book and took out all the dirty words and made this amazing list. And I think the list was more popular, in fact, on the internet than the book. Nobody read the book, but they loved the list. And so it is a really complicated problem, and especially with arousal. You're trying to write something that is in some way sexy, right? That's one goal, but also that feels new, fresh, funny, exciting, odd, strange, whatever. And the two are sort of at odds. And there's a certain moment when you're telling a story when you want to use the word that isn't fresh, new, and strange, but the sort of traditional old word that is just going to get you by the spine, So it's sort of like there's timing in the midst of a story. There's a moment where you may want to use the word that is almost shockingly over-familiar. And that leads you to when it works, it works.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
Hello. This is my question to both of you. Since both of you are in music, so how do you manage your profession actually? How do you balance your profession, both the professions you are in? I'm a surgeon, I'm a student of surgery, so I also write poems sometimes, but how do you manage? How do you cope up with your professions?
I am a very amateur musician. I love to write songs, and I have songs on iTunes, but it's not like that is my day job or anything. There's this thing called Spotify, you listen to all the songs in the universe. Anytime somebody listens to one of my songs, I get 1/2 of 1 cent. So there's no business model or anything. It's pure joy, and the writing is what I do to live, and it's what I do better. But the music is what really gets me excited, and I still think there's a kind of exciting immediacy to being able to make sounds on a keyboard. Words are codes, and so when you're typing something that sounds like a human voice, but you're actually destroying or removing all of the voice from it, and you end up with these sequences of bones on the page, right? Words, 26 letters, it's very frustrating, or whatever characters you have. So music is an escape from that for me. It's a way of hearing things immediately that come back more beautifully than the sound that my fingers are made if I didn't have a keyboard under them. What about you, Jeet?
I'm terrible with balancing, actually. I just do one or the other on a given day, and I think I've been doing the music thing for just way too long. It's been about a year now, so it might be time to get back to the writing. Do we have time for one more question? Yes. Make it a good one, people. Yes, go ahead.
You've been such a nice audience. Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed it. Let me hear the question.
Hi, I wanted to ask Nicholson Baker of 30-year-old who wrote Vox, what would he think of 50 Shades of Grey? And the Nicholson Baker now, what would he think of 50 Shades of Grey, whether it's funny or arousing?
Wow, well that's a hard question for me because I decided, all right, Shades of Grey came out the same year that House of Holes. They both have 3 words in the title, and Shades of Grey, I remember people coming up to me in the small town where I live, all right, no privacy, they came up to me saying, Nick, you must read this book. So I got it on my little machine, and I started to read it to my wife, and we both, I think it's that I am wrongly wired, but I don't get domination and all that stuff. I don't get it. So I don't understand it. It's not sexy to me. So it just didn't work for me. But it obviously worked for millions and millions of people, and I think there must be something to a book that creates that kind of reaction in people. So I have to respect it. I just haven't read it. And when I wrote Vox, I had not read much erotic literature. You know, I'd read a little Anais Nin and Penthouse letters and stuff. What I discovered before I wrote House of Holes was that Fanny Hill is a fantastic book. And I went to Planet Fitness, which is an exercise place, and I listened to Fanny Hill on my headphones. On LibriVox, read by all kinds of volunteers, and that's an incredibly good experience. So my feeling now is just, I guess, total ignorance about Shades of Grey, except that I like the cover. Beautiful gray tie, very restrained. I like that. Beyond that, I have nothing interesting to say about it. Have you read Shades of Grey?
About a chapter, yeah.
Chapter here and there?
A page here and there. Yeah, I couldn't do the whole book, I have to admit.
I mean, we have had, the revolution has happened. There were 2 revolutions, one in the 60s with Portnoy's Complaint and books like that, and then the second revolution happened in the 90s with people like Susie Bright and the sort of sex-positive feminist kind of things. And I felt that I was in a tiny way part of that second revolution. Now both revolutions are over, and now we can write anything we want. And I really think that's a positive, good thing. That we really should celebrate the fact that Shades of Grey can be for sale in every airport, and people just buy it with a kind of triumphant feeling that, you know, it's almost, you buy Shades of Grey with a feeling of empowerment or something. That's okay. I think that's a good thing, actually. I mean, it seems like a healthy thing. I'm looking forward to what comes next.
Nick, thank you. It's been illuminating and arousing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming here. Thanks to JF for bringing him. It's been a privilege to be here on the stage with you. Thank you, and see you.
Thank you, Jeet. Thank you, Nick. That was an extremely interesting session. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of Vox. Our next session will start in another 10 minutes or so, which is session number 155.